Good evening. Tonight, we're going to talk about a man who conquered most of the known world before breakfast, founded 70 cities before lunch, and then mysteriously died at 32 before dinner. His name was Alexander III of Macedon, though history knows him better as Alexander the Great. And here's the thing about Alexander. He didn't just die. He didn't fall in battle like a proper conqueror should. No, Alexander the Great, the man who'd never lost a single military engagement, who'd marched his armies from Greece to India, who'd made Darius III of Persia cry into his silk cushions, died in bed, in Babylon, after 11 days of agony, and nobody, not his generals, not his doctors, not even modern historians, can agree on how or why. Was it poison slipped into his wine by a jealous rival? Was it a curse from the gods, angry at his hubris? Or was it something far stranger, something that would make even the most hardened conspiracy theorist pause and reconsider their life choices? The truth is, Alexander's death is one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, a puzzle that has confounded scholars for over 2,000 years. Picture this. The year is 323 BCE. Alexander has just finished his latest world tour, which, unlike most world tours, involved considerably more stabbing and significantly less singing. He's sitting in Babylon, the jewel of his vast empire that stretches from Greece to India, planning his next conquest, because apparently owning most of the civilized world wasn't quite enough for our boy Alex. He's 32, at the absolute peak of his power, surrounded by wealth that would make modern tech billionaires weep with envy. And then, in the span of just 11 days, he goes from world conqueror to world's most famous corpse. But here's where it gets interesting. Alexander didn't just die, he died weird, really weird. The kind of weird that makes you wonder if the ancient world had access to substances we haven't even invented yet. Before we dive deeper into this medical mystery that makes House MD look like a children's picture book, let me ask you something. Alexander's empire once stretched from Greece to India, encompassing dozens of time zones and countless cultures. So tell me, where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below, because unlike Alexander's empire, I'd love to see this community actually stick together for more than 5 minutes. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you don't want your story to vanish into historical mystery the way Alexander's did. Now, back to our regularly scheduled ancient conspiracy theory. The thing about Alexander is that everything he did was larger than life, including, apparently, his death. This wasn't a quiet passing in the night. This wasn't a peaceful farewell surrounded by loved ones. This was 11 days of the kind of suffering that would make medieval torture devices seem like spa treatments. To understand just how bizarre Alexander's death really was, we need to understand who Alexander was at the height of his power. By 323 BCE, Alexander had been ruling for 13 years and conquering for even longer. He'd inherited the throne of Macedon at 20, after his father, Philip II, was assassinated at his daughter's wedding. And if you think family drama is complicated now, just wait until you hear about Macedonian royal politics. Philip's assassination had been orchestrated by his own bodyguard, Pausanias, in what was either a crime of passion or a political conspiracy so complex that historians are still arguing about it today. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was almost certainly involved, because Olympias was the kind of woman who collected enemies like some people collect stamps, and she had about as much maternal warmth as a Siberian winter. But Alexander didn't just inherit his father's throne, he inherited his father's vision of conquest. Philip had been planning to invade Persia, the great enemy of the Greek world, and Alexander decided to turn his father's plan into reality. What followed was one of the most successful military campaigns in human history, a 13-year rampage across 3 continents that left Alexander in control of an empire stretching from Egypt to India. But conquest, as it turns out, is easier than administration. By 323 BCE, Alexander was struggling with problems that would have challenged even the most experienced ruler. His empire was vast, diverse, and held together primarily by his personal charisma and the loyalty of his army. He had Greeks who thought he'd gone native, Persians who thought he was a foreign usurper, and Macedonians who thought he'd forgotten where he came from. Add to this the fact that Alexander had been living like a rock star on a world tour for over a decade. He drank heavily, fought constantly, and had survived wounds that would have killed lesser men. He'd taken an arrow through the chest in India that nearly punctured his lung. He'd been clubbed unconscious in battles more times than a professional boxer. His body was a roadmap of scars from Egypt to Afghanistan. And then there was the psychological toll. Alexander had started his conquests believing he was descended from Achilles and Heracles. By the end, he was convinced he was actually divine, the son of Zeus Ammon, deserving of worship from his subjects. This wasn't just ego. This was the kind of megalomania that would make modern dictators seek therapy. So when Alexander arrived in Babylon in 323 BCE, he was already a man on the edge. He was planning his next conquest, Arabia, which would have required mobilizing massive resources and organizing the most complex logistical operation in ancient history. He was dealing with mutinies among his troops, who were exhausted and wanted to go home. He was managing tensions between his Greek, Macedonian, and Persian administrators, who trusted each other about as much as cats trust vacuum cleaners. In short, Alexander was a man under enormous stress, in poor physical health, operating in a political environment where everyone had reasons to want him dead. The stage was set for disaster. Let's set the scene more precisely. It's late May, 323 BCE. The weather in Babylon is already getting uncomfortably hot, with temperatures reaching levels that would make modern air conditioning seem like a divine gift. The city itself is a marvel of ancient engineering, but like all ancient cities, it's also a breeding ground for disease. The canals and marshes that make Babylon prosperous also make it a paradise for mosquitoes, flies, and other vectors of disease. Alexander has returned to Babylon after his Indian campaign, and he's not in a good mood. The Indian expedition had been a partial failure, forced to turn back when his troops mutinied and refused to march further east. For a man who'd never experienced defeat, this had been a psychological blow. He'd spent months trying to find ways to continue the campaign, but eventually had to accept that even his legendary army had limits. Now he's planning something even more ambitious, the conquest of Arabia. This isn't just about adding territory to his empire. It's about proving that the Indian mutiny was a temporary setback, that he's still the unstoppable conqueror he's always been. But the Arabian campaign will require resources on a scale that dwarfs even his previous conquests. To understand the magnitude of what Alexander was planning, consider this. Arabia in 323 BCE was largely unexplored territory. The Greeks and Persians knew it existed. They knew it was the source of valuable spices and incense, but they had no detailed knowledge of its geography, peoples, or resources. Alexander was essentially planning to invade and conquer a continent-sized question mark. The logistical challenges were staggering. Arabia is largely desert, which meant that any invasion force would need to carry its own water and supplies across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. The local peoples were nomadic and warlike, masters of desert warfare who could appear and disappear like ghosts. And unlike his previous conquests, where Alexander could rely on existing roads and infrastructure, Arabia would require building supply lines from scratch. But Alexander was undaunted. He'd already begun assembling a massive invasion force, gathering ships from across his empire to create the largest naval expedition in ancient history. He was recruiting soldiers from every corner of his domain, planning to field an army that would make his previous forces look like scouting parties. The scope of his ambition was breathtaking and, to many of his advisors, deeply concerning. Alexander was planning to conquer Arabia, then use it as a base for further conquests in Africa, He talked about sailing around Africa to attack Carthage from the south, about conquering the mysterious lands beyond the Sahara, about extending his empire to literally every corner of the known world. This wasn't strategy, this was obsession. Alexander couldn't stop conquering because conquest was the only thing that made sense to him anymore. He'd spent his entire adult life at war, and peace felt like failure. The idea of simply governing his existing empire, of consolidating his gains and building lasting institutions, seemed to bore him. His closest advisors were worried, and not just about the feasibility of the Arabian campaign. Alexander's behavior had become increasingly erratic and paranoid. He'd executed several of his oldest friends on charges of treason, including Philotas, the son of his most trusted general, and Callisthenes, his court historian. He'd adopted Persian court customs that his Macedonian followers found offensive, and he'd begun demanding that his subjects prostrate themselves before him like Persian subjects before their king. The drinking had gotten worse, too. Macedonian nobles had always been heavy drinkers, but Alexander's consumption had reached levels that concerned even his hard-drinking companions. He could consume quantities of wine that would put modern alcoholics in the hospital, and he seemed to use alcohol as a way to cope with the enormous pressures of ruling an empire that spanned 3 continents. So when Alexander attended the drinking party at Medius of Larissa's house on that fateful evening in late May, he was already a man in crisis. The party itself was typical of Macedonian aristocratic entertainment, a symposium where the elite would gather to drink, discuss philosophy, and prove their masculinity through competitive consumption of wine. But this wasn't just any party. The guest list read like a who's who of Alexander's inner circle: generals who commanded armies, administrators who governed provinces, and courtiers who had followed Alexander from Macedon to India and back again. These were the men who really ran Alexander's empire, and they were all watching their king with growing concern. Alexander, as usual, was determined to prove that he could outdrink everyone present. This wasn't just about alcohol tolerance, it was about dominance, about proving that he was still the alpha male in a culture that valued physical prowess above almost everything else. In Macedonian society, the ability to hold your liquor was almost as important as the ability to hold a spear. The wine was strong, mixed with water according to Greek custom, but still potent enough to intoxicate grown men who'd spent decades building up tolerance. The conversation was the usual mix of war stories, political gossip, and philosophical speculation that passed for sophisticated discourse in Alexander's circle. And then, according to Plutarch and other ancient sources, something went wrong. Alexander was in the middle of drinking from a large cup, probably a kylix that held several ounces of wine, when he suddenly cried out in pain. Some accounts describe it as a sharp cry, others as more of a gasp, but all agree that it was sudden and unexpected. The description of what happened next varies depending on which ancient source you trust, but the general outline is consistent. Alexander clutched at his side or his back, as if struck by a sudden, severe pain. He may have doubled over, or stumbled, or simply stood there in shock. The other party guests initially thought it might be a joke, or perhaps just the wine hitting him harder than usual. But this wasn't the wine, and it definitely wasn't a joke. Whatever had struck Alexander was serious enough to cut through his legendary alcohol tolerance and leave him visibly distressed. The man who'd taken an arrow through the chest and kept fighting was obviously in significant pain. What happened immediately after varies in the historical accounts. Some suggest that Alexander tried to continue the party, attempting to laugh off whatever had happened to him. Others indicate that he left immediately, supported by his friends and bodyguards. But all sources agree on one crucial point. From that moment on, Alexander began a descent into illness that would end with his death 11 days later. The first few days of Alexander's illness might have seemed manageable to his doctors and courtiers. Ancient medicine had limited diagnostic capabilities, so the early symptoms would have been treated as a common ailment. perhaps something he'd eaten or drunk that disagreed with him. But as the days passed, it became clear that this was no ordinary illness. Alexander developed a high fever that his doctors couldn't break, despite their best efforts. Ancient physicians had a variety of treatments for fever: cool baths, herbal remedies, bloodletting, and various other techniques that were the height of medical sophistication in 323 BCE. None of them worked. The fever was accompanied by severe abdominal pain that left Alexander writhing in agony. Ancient sources describe him as being unable to find a comfortable position, constantly shifting and moving as if trying to escape some internal torment. The pain was so severe that it cut through whatever pain medications were available in the ancient world, which were primitive by modern standards, but not entirely ineffective. As the illness progressed, Alexander began to lose his voice. This was particularly ominous in ancient medical understanding, as the voice was considered connected to the soul or life force. A ruler who couldn't speak was a ruler who couldn't command, and in Alexander's autocratic system, a king who couldn't give orders was essentially useless. The loss of voice was followed by increasing paralysis, starting in his extremities and gradually working inward. Alexander's hands and feet became numb and unresponsive. Then the paralysis spread to his arms and legs. Ancient sources describe him as becoming unable to move, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed his will. But perhaps most disturbing of all, according to the historical accounts, Alexander's mind remained clear throughout most of his ordeal. He was conscious and aware, able to understand what was happening to him even as his body systematically shut down. For a man who'd spent his entire life in physical control of his environment, this must have been a particularly cruel form of torture. The psychological impact on Alexander's court was enormous. These were men who'd followed him across the known world, who'd seen him survive countless battles and injuries, who'd come to believe that he really might be divine. Watching him slowly waste away in bed, helpless and in pain, shattered their fundamental assumptions about his invincibility. The political implications were even worse. Alexander had never formally named a successor, partly because he couldn't bear the thought of anyone else wielding his power, and partly because he genuinely seemed to believe he was immortal. As it became clear that he might actually die, panic began to spread through the highest levels of his administration. Alexander's empire was held together by personal loyalty to him, not by institutions or laws. If he died without a clear succession plan, the entire structure would collapse into civil war. His generals knew this, his administrators knew this, and the various peoples of his empire knew this. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen and preparing for the worst. The medical efforts to save Alexander became increasingly desperate as the days passed. Ancient physicians called in every expert they could find, consulted every medical text available, and tried every treatment known to medical science in 323 BCE. They attempted various combinations of herbs and drugs, performed ritual purifications, and even consulted priests and oracles for divine guidance. Nothing worked. If anything, Alexander seemed to be getting worse, and the strange nature of his symptoms baffled his doctors. The combination of fever, abdominal pain, paralysis, and mental clarity didn't match any known disease in the ancient medical understanding. His physicians were essentially flying blind, trying treatments that had worked for other conditions and hoping for the best. As Alexander's condition deteriorated, rumors began to spread throughout Babylon and beyond. Word traveled fast in the ancient world when it concerned the health of rulers, and Alexander's illness became the subject of intense speculation throughout his empire. Was he dying? Had he been poisoned? Were the gods punishing him for his hubris? The rumors were fueled by the bizarre nature of Alexander's symptoms and the obvious confusion of his doctors. If the best medical minds of the age couldn't diagnose or treat Alexander's illness, then clearly something supernatural was at work. The ancient world had a much more fluid boundary between natural and supernatural explanations for unusual events. and Alexander's mysterious illness seemed to demand a supernatural explanation. On the 10th day of his illness, according to ancient accounts, Alexander's condition seemed to stabilize somewhat. His fever may have broken temporarily, and he regained enough strength to meet with some of his generals and administrators. This gave false hope to his supporters, who began to believe that he might recover after all. But this improvement was temporary. On the 11th day, Alexander took a turn for the worse, and it became clear that he was dying. His breathing became labored, his fever returned with a vengeance, and he slipped into a state of semi-consciousness from which he would not recover. The final hours of Alexander's life were witnessed by his closest companions, but their accounts of what exactly happened are frustratingly vague. Some sources suggest that he died peacefully, others that his final moments were marked by struggle and pain. What's clear is that on June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great breathed his last in a room in the palace of Babylon. But here's where the mystery deepens even further. According to several ancient sources, Alexander's body showed no signs of decomposition for days after his death. In the heat of a Babylonian summer, with temperatures well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, a dead body should begin to decay within hours. Instead, Alexander's corpse remained fresh and uncorrupted, as if he were merely sleeping rather than dead. This detail has been interpreted in various ways over the centuries. Ancient writers saw it as evidence of Alexander's divine nature, proof that he was indeed the son of a god, and therefore not subject to ordinary mortal limitations. Modern medical experts have suggested various explanations, from unusual preservation conditions to misdiagnosis of death, but the lack of decomposition adds another layer of mystery to an already puzzling death. Combined with the unusual symptoms, the 11-day duration of the illness, and the complete failure of ancient medicine to provide effective treatment, it creates a picture of a death that seems almost designed to baffle investigators. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like the setup for a particularly elaborate murder mystery, you're not alone. For over 2,000 years, historians, medical experts, and conspiracy theorists have been trying to solve the puzzle of Alexander's death, and the theories they've come up with range from the merely plausible to the absolutely bonkers. Let's start with the most obvious suspect: poison. After all, when a young, healthy conqueror suddenly drops dead after drinking wine at a party, poison seems like the logical culprit. It's got all the elements of a good murder mystery: motive, opportunity, and a cast of characters with more reasons to want Alexander dead than a daytime soap opera villain. The poison theory isn't just speculation from modern amateur detectives. Even Alexander's contemporaries suspected foul play. The king's own mother, Olympias of Epirus, was convinced her son had been murdered, and Olympias wasn't the kind of woman you wanted to cross. She was known for keeping snakes as pets, practicing mysterious religious rituals, and having an uncomfortably close relationship with various Dionysiac cults. When Olympias suspected you of murder, you were probably already planning your funeral. Olympias had her own reasons for promoting the poison theory. If Alexander had died of natural causes, it would suggest that she'd failed in her maternal duty to protect him, which would have been politically damaging. But if he'd been murdered, then she could position herself as the grieving mother seeking justice, which was a much more sympathetic role. But Olympias wasn't the only one who suspected poison. Many of Alexander's soldiers and lower-ranking officers also believed their king had been murdered. These men had followed Alexander across the known world, had seen him survive incredible dangers, and couldn't believe that he would simply die of illness at the peak of his power. For them, poison was the only explanation that made sense. The poison theory gained even more credibility when Alexander's successors began fighting each other for control of his empire. If Alexander had died naturally, then the civil wars that followed could be seen as an unfortunate but understandable consequence of his failure to plan for succession. But if he'd been murdered, then the wars could be interpreted as the inevitable result of a conspiracy that had always been intended to destroy his empire. But who would want to poison Alexander? Well, that's where things get complicated, because the list of people with motives to kill Alexander reads like a phone book from hell. Let's start with the most obvious suspect, Antipater, Alexander's regent in Macedonia. Antipater had been left to govern Macedonia and Greece, while Alexander was off conquering the world, and by all accounts, he'd done a decent job. He'd kept the Greek cities in line, managed the complex logistics of supporting Alexander's campaigns, and maintained the loyalty of the Macedonian homeland. But Alexander had been growing increasingly suspicious of his regent, partly because paranoia was Alexander's natural state of being, and partly because ruling an empire tends to make you question everyone's loyalty, including your own mother's. Distance breeds suspicion, and Alexander had been away from Macedonia for over a decade, relying on reports and letters to stay informed about what was happening at home. Those reports hadn't always been favorable to Antipater. There had been tensions with Alexander's mother Olympias, who'd remained in Macedonia and had her own ideas about how the kingdom should be governed. There had been complaints from Greek cities about Antipater's administration, and rumors of corruption and abuse of power. Alexander had been sending increasingly threatening messages to Antipater, demanding explanations for various administrative decisions, questioning his loyalty, and generally making it clear that when he returned to Macedonia, there would be a rather uncomfortable conversation waiting. Some sources suggest that Alexander had already decided to replace Antipater as regent, and was only waiting for a suitable moment to make the change. From Antipater's perspective, Alexander's death would solve a lot of problems very quickly. A dead Alexander couldn't replace him, couldn't investigate his administration, and couldn't punish him for any real or imagined failures. Moreover, as the senior administrator in Macedonia, Antipater would be well positioned to play a major role in whatever government followed Alexander's death. Antipater also had the means to carry out such a murder. As regent of Macedonia, he controlled the kingdom's resources and had access to agents throughout Alexander's empire. If anyone could have arranged for poison to be delivered to Alexander in distant Babylon, it would have been Antipater. But the most compelling suspect in the poison theory might be Antipater's son, Cassander. Cassander had even more reason to want Alexander dead, and he'd been personally humiliated by the king on multiple occasions. The relationship between Alexander and Cassander had been poisonous for years. Cassander was roughly Alexander's age, the son of one of Macedonia's most powerful nobles, and he'd grown up expecting to play a major role in Macedonian politics. But Alexander's conquests had changed everything, creating opportunities for advancement that were based on military skill and personal loyalty to the king rather than traditional noble birth. Cassander had never been one of Alexander's inner circle of friends and companions. He'd been left behind in Macedonia when Alexander began his conquests, forced to watch from the sidelines as men he considered his social inferiors rose to positions of enormous power and wealth. This bred a deep resentment that Alexander seemed to enjoy provoking. There are multiple accounts of Alexander publicly humiliating Cassander. The most famous incident occurred when Cassander was visiting Alexander's court in Asia, according to Plutarch. Alexander became angry with Cassander over some minor issue and grabbed him by the hair, slamming his head against a wall in front of the entire court. This wasn't just physical abuse. It was a calculated public humiliation designed to show everyone present that Cassander, despite his noble birth, was nothing more than Alexander's servant. In a culture where honor and reputation were everything, such treatment would have been devastatingly shameful. Cassander, understandably, held a grudge. The kind of grudge that might motivate someone to slip something nasty into a wine cup. He had the motive, and as the son of Macedonia's regent, he would have had access to the resources needed to arrange such a murder. Moreover, Cassander's behavior after Alexander's death is suggestive. He became one of the most ruthless of Alexander's successors, eventually gaining control of Macedonia and systematically murdering Alexander's surviving family members. including his mother, Olympias, his wife Roxana, and his young son. This wasn't just political necessity, it seemed personal, as if Cassander was settling old scores. But the poison theory faces some significant obstacles that have kept historians debating for centuries. First, there's the issue of the symptoms. Alexander's illness lasted 11 days, with symptoms that don't match any known poison available in the ancient world. Most poisons work quickly, not slowly. The kind of prolonged, agonizing death that Alexander experienced would require either a very sophisticated poison that didn't exist in 323 BCE, or a series of smaller doses administered over time. The problem with the sophisticated poison theory is that ancient toxicology was relatively primitive. The Greeks and Romans knew about various plant and mineral poisons, but they didn't have access to the kind of refined, slow-acting substances that might produce Alexander's symptoms. Most ancient poisons were crude affairs that killed quickly and obviously, not gradually and mysteriously. The repeated dosing theory is more plausible but faces its own problems. Alexander was constantly surrounded by food tasters, bodyguards, and servants whose job it was to protect him from exactly this kind of attack. Administering poison to someone under such heavy security would be extremely difficult, and doing it repeatedly over 11 days would be nearly impossible. Moreover, Alexander's symptoms don't match those of most known ancient poisons. Arsenic, one of the most sophisticated poisons available in the ancient world, causes different symptoms than those described in historical accounts of Alexander's illness. Lead poisoning, another possibility, also doesn't match the historical descriptions. Second, there's the matter of opportunity. While it's true that Alexander drank wine at Medias's party, he didn't immediately fall ill. According to most accounts, there was a delay between the party and the onset of his symptoms, which doesn't match what you'd expect from a poisoning. If someone had slipped something into Alexander's wine at the party, you'd expect a more immediate reaction. Most poisons don't have delayed effects measured in hours or days. The timeline simply doesn't support the idea that Alexander was poisoned at the symposium where his illness allegedly began. This has led some proponents of the poison theory to suggest that Alexander might have been poisoned before the party, with the wine simply triggering symptoms that were already developing. But this creates even more problems, because it would require the poisoner to have extremely precise knowledge of how the substance would affect Alexander and exactly when symptoms would appear. Third, and perhaps most damaging for the poison theory, is the lack of evidence. Despite extensive investigations by Alexander's successors, including some rather aggressive questioning of anyone who'd been near the king in his final days, no concrete evidence of poisoning was ever found, and these weren't gentle inquiries. Ancient interrogation techniques had a way of extracting confessions from people, whether they were guilty or not. If there had been a conspiracy to poison Alexander, it's likely that someone would have talked, either voluntarily or under duress. The investigation was particularly thorough because Alexander's successors had their own political reasons for wanting to identify any conspirators. If there had been a plot to murder Alexander, the conspirators might still be active, and they could pose a threat to the new rulers. But despite intensive investigations, no evidence of a conspiracy was found. The lack of evidence doesn't definitively disprove the poison theory, but it does raise serious questions about its plausibility. In the ancient world, political murders were usually accompanied by considerable evidence, if only because they required the cooperation of multiple people and were difficult to keep secret. But perhaps the most significant problem with the poison theory is that it assumes a level of sophistication and planning that may not have been possible in 323 BCE. The kind of slacting, difficult to detect poison that would be needed to kill Alexander in the manner described simply didn't exist in the ancient world. This brings us to a more exotic possibility, that Alexander was killed by a curse. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally cursed by the gods or by the spirits of those he'd wronged during his conquests. Now, Before you roll your eyes and click away to watch cat videos, consider this. Alexander had spent his entire adult life systematically destroying sacred sites, looting temples, and generally behaving in ways that would have made ancient peoples believe the gods were taking notes. From the perspective of ancient religious belief, Alexander's sudden illness and death would have seemed like cosmic justice. The curse theory isn't just New Age nonsense. It's based on some genuinely unsettling historical patterns and Alexander's own behavior in his final weeks. Alexander himself seemed to believe he was cursed in his final days, becoming increasingly paranoid about omens and signs that suggested his doom was approaching. To understand why the curse theory made sense to ancient peoples, we need to understand just how much religious and cultural destruction Alexander had caused during his conquests. This wasn't just military conquest. It was cultural genocide on a scale that would have horrified even ancient peoples who were accustomed to warfare. Alexander's campaigns had destroyed countless temples, sacred groves, and religious sites throughout his empire. He'd looted treasures from some of the most sacred locations in the ancient world, including the great temples of Egypt and Mesopotamia. He'd forced conquered peoples to abandon their traditional religious practices and adopt Greek customs. Perhaps most significantly, Alexander had demanded that his subjects worship him as a god. This wasn't unusual for conquered peoples, who often deified their rulers as a political necessity. But Alexander was demanding this worship from Greeks and Macedonians, peoples who had very specific ideas about the relationship between mortals and gods. From the perspective of ancient religious belief, Alexander's demand for divine worship was the kind of hubris that the gods punished swiftly and severely. The Greeks had a word for this: nemesis, divine retribution for excessive pride. And Alexander, by the end of his life, was exhibiting the kind of excessive pride that would have made Icarus tell him to tone it down a bit. The curse theory gains credibility when we examine Alexander's behavior in his final weeks. According to historical accounts, he became increasingly obsessed with omens and portents that seemed to predict his doom. This wasn't typical behavior for Alexander, who'd spent most of his career dismissing superstitions and religious concerns in favor of practical military and political considerations. But in Babylon, Alexander seemed genuinely frightened by various signs and omens that his court magicians and priests interpreted as warnings of impending disaster. The most famous of these incidents involved his royal diadem, the crown that symbolized his authority over his vast empire. A few days before he fell ill, a strong wind blew the diadem off Alexander's head while he was sailing on one of the canals near Babylon. The crown fell into the water and was carried by the current into a marsh filled with reeds. One of his servants, a man named Seleucus, dove into the marsh to retrieve it, but not before it had been floating among the reeds for some time. Now, this might seem like a trivial incident, but in the ancient world, the loss of a royal crown was considered an extremely serious omen. The crown represented the king's divine mandate to rule, and its loss or damage was interpreted as a sign that the gods were withdrawing their support. Alexander's court, magicians and priests were unanimous in their interpretation. The incident with the diadem meant that Alexander's reign was coming to an end. Some went further, suggesting that the king himself might be in mortal danger. Alexander, who usually dismissed such superstitions, was reportedly deeply disturbed by the incident and its interpretation. According to Plutarch, he became increasingly anxious and began performing elaborate sacrifices and rituals designed to appease whatever gods might be angry with him. Then there were the ravens. In the days leading up to his illness, unusual numbers of ravens were seen around Babylon, particularly near the palace where Alexander was staying. Ravens, in ancient belief systems, were messengers of death and doom, associated with battlefield carrion and the underworld. The appearance of large numbers of ravens in a place where they weren't normally common struck Alexander's court as more than coincidental. These weren't just ordinary birds. They were harbingers of disaster, signs that the gods were preparing something terrible. Ancient sources describe the ravens as behaving strangely, gathering in large flocks and making unusual noises that sounded almost like human voices. Some of Alexander's courtiers claimed to have heard the ravens speaking prophecies of doom, though this was probably the result of fear and superstition rather than actual communication with supernatural forces. But perhaps the most unsettling omen was Alexander's own dreams. In his final weeks, he reportedly suffered from vivid nightmares that left him exhausted and frightened. These weren't ordinary anxiety dreams. They were elaborate visions of death, destruction, and divine punishment that seemed to predict his own doom. According to some accounts, Alexander dreamed of being judged by the gods for his crimes against the peoples he'd conquered. He saw visions of the temples he'd destroyed, the priests he'd killed, and the sacred sites he'd desecrated. In these dreams, the gods pronounced sentence upon him, condemning him to a slow, agonizing death as punishment for his hubris. The dreams became so disturbing that Alexander began to lose sleep, which would have further weakened his already compromised physical condition. Ancient medicine recognized the connection between mental state and physical health, and Alexander's increasing anxiety and fear would have made him more susceptible to whatever illness eventually killed him. But the most compelling aspect of the curse theory isn't the omens or the dreams. It's Alexander's own behavior in his final months. He had begun to act like a man who believed he was doomed, making increasingly reckless decisions and alienating the people closest to him. Alexander had always been ruthless, but in his final months, his cruelty took on an almost suicidal quality. He executed several of his oldest friends and most trusted advisors on charges of treason, including men who'd served him faithfully for decades. These executions weren't just politically motivated. They seemed driven by a paranoid belief that everyone was plotting against him. The most shocking of these executions was that of Callisthenes, Alexander's court historian and a nephew of the philosopher Aristotle. Callisthenes had been responsible for recording Alexander's achievements and promoting his legend throughout the Greek world. But he'd also been critical of Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his demand for divine worship. Alexander had Callisthenes tortured and executed on charges of conspiracy, despite the fact that there was little evidence to support the accusation. The execution shocked the Greek intellectual community and alienated many of Alexander's supporters who saw it as an attack on Greek culture and philosophy. Even more disturbing was Alexander's treatment of his own soldiers. During his final months, he'd begun executing ordinary soldiers for minor infractions, creating a climate of fear and resentment in his army. These weren't strategic executions designed to maintain discipline. They seemed motivated by rage and paranoia. This behavior created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By alienating his closest advisors and supporters, Alexander actually did create the conditions for conspiracy and rebellion. His paranoia about betrayal made betrayal more likely, not less. From the perspective of ancient religious belief, this deterioration in Alexander's judgment and character could be interpreted as evidence that the gods had already begun their punishment. Divine curses weren't just about supernatural death, they were about the corruption of the soul, the gradual destruction of everything that made a person human. The curse theory also helps explain some of the more bizarre aspects of Alexander's death, particularly the lack of decomposition in his body after death. In ancient belief systems, this could be interpreted as a sign of divine intervention, either preserving the body as a mark of special favor or preventing its natural decay as part of some cosmic punishment. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for the curse theory comes from Alexander's own words in his final days. According to several ancient sources, he spoke repeatedly about being called by the gods, about hearing voices that summoned him to join them in the afterlife. This wasn't the rambling of a fevered mind. It was the systematic expression of a man who believed he was being claimed by supernatural forces. Alexander's court physicians were baffled by these statements because they suggested that their patient was experiencing symptoms that had no medical explanation. Ancient medicine recognized various forms of mental illness, but Alexander's visions and voices seemed different from ordinary madness. They were too coherent, too consistent, and too obviously connected to his religious transgressions. But curses, like poison, have their problems as an explanation for Alexander's death. The main issue is that curses, by definition, aren't medically verifiable. We can analyze tissue samples, study historical accounts, and reconstruct diets, but we can't exactly run tests for supernatural intervention. Moreover, the curse theory relies on accepting ancient religious beliefs that most modern people would consider superstitious nonsense. While it's important to understand how ancient peoples interpreted events, that doesn't mean their interpretations were factually correct. This brings us to the third major category of theories, medical explanations, and this is where things get both more scientific and somehow more disturbing than either poison or curses. Because modern medicine has identified several diseases that could explain Alexander's symptoms, and some of them are genuinely terrifying. Modern medical experts have proposed a variety of diseases that could explain Alexander's death. These range from relatively common infections to rare tropical diseases that would have been unknown to ancient physicians, and each theory is supported by detailed analysis of the historical symptoms. One of the most compelling medical theories is that Alexander died of typhoid fever. Typhoid is caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi and was extremely common in the ancient world, particularly in urban centers with poor sanitation. Babylon, despite its wealth and grandeur, would have been a perfect breeding ground for such infections. The city's complex system of canals and irrigation channels, while essential for agriculture and transportation, also created ideal conditions for waterborne diseases. Human waste, animal refuse, and rotting organic matter would have contaminated the water supply, creating a bacterial paradise that would have horrified modern public health officials. Alexander's symptoms match many of the classic signs of typhoid fever. The disease typically begins with high fever, severe headaches, and abdominal pain, all of which are mentioned in ancient accounts of Alexander's final illness. As typhoid progresses, patients often develop weakness, confusion, and in severe cases, paralysis. The timeline also fits. Typhoid fever can take several days to develop after infection, which would explain the delay between Alexander's attendance at the drinking party and the onset of his symptoms. The disease can also linger for weeks in severe cases, which matches the 11-day duration of Alexander's final illness. Moreover, typhoid fever can be fatal, particularly in cases where the victim is already weakened by stress, exhaustion, and poor diet. Alexander, after years of constant military campaigning, consuming questionable food and water across half the known world, would have been in exactly the kind of compromised physical state that would make him vulnerable to serious infection. Dr. David Aldock, a physician at the University of Maryland, has made a particularly strong case for the typhoid theory. He points out that Alexander's symptoms, including the high fever, abdominal pain, and progressive weakness, are textbook examples of severe typhoid infection. He also notes that the disease would have been endemic in Babylon, making infection almost inevitable for someone staying in the city for an extended period. But typhoid fever doesn't explain all of Alexander's symptoms, particularly the paralysis and the alleged preservation of his body after death. For those aspects of the mystery, medical experts have proposed more exotic explanations. One theory suggests that Alexander suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disorder that attacks the peripheral nervous system. This condition can cause exactly the kind of paralysis described in historical accounts, where the patient loses control of their limbs while retaining mental clarity. Guillain-Barré syndrome is particularly interesting as a potential explanation, because it can be triggered by various infections, including typhoid fever. This would create a neat medical explanation for all of Alexander's symptoms. He contracted typhoid fever, which weakened his immune system and triggered an autoimmune response that caused the paralysis. The syndrome typically begins with weakness in the feet and legs, then progresses upward through the body. In severe cases, it can cause complete paralysis while leaving the patient's mind completely clear. This matches the historical descriptions of Alexander's final days, when he was reportedly unable to move but remained mentally alert until near the end. Dr. Leo Rankin, a neurologist who has studied the case, argues that Guillain-Barré syndrome explains not only Alexander's paralysis, but also the lack of decomposition in his body after death. He suggests that Alexander might not have actually been dead when his court physicians pronounced him so, but rather in a state of complete paralysis that made him appear lifeless. This theory is genuinely chilling when you think about it. It suggests that Alexander might have been conscious and aware while everyone around him believed he was dead, trapped in a paralyzed body, unable to communicate or move. In an age before modern medical diagnostics, distinguishing between death and complete paralysis would have been extremely difficult. The preservation of Alexander's body, from this perspective, wouldn't be evidence of divine intervention or unusual environmental conditions. It would be evidence that he was still alive, his body preserved by continuing biological processes that his doctors couldn't detect. Another medical theory proposes that Alexander died of acute pancreatitis, possibly triggered by his legendary alcohol consumption. Alexander was notorious throughout the ancient world for his ability to consume wine in quantities that would kill ordinary men. An acute pancreatitis can cause exactly the kind of severe abdominal pain described in historical accounts. Pancreatitis is inflammation of the pancreas, usually caused by gallstones or chronic alcohol abuse. The condition causes severe pain that patients often describe as the worst they've ever experienced, radiating from the abdomen to the back and sides. The pain is so intense that it can cause shock and unconsciousness, and in severe cases, the condition can be fatal. Dr. Eugene Borza, a historian who has studied Alexander extensively, argues that the king's drinking habits would have made him a prime candidate for acute pancreatitis. Ancient sources describe Alexander as capable of consuming enormous quantities of wine, often drinking continuously for days during religious festivals or victory celebrations. The pancreatitis theory is supported by descriptions of Alexander's pain, which seem to match the characteristics of pancreatic inflammation. Ancient sources describe him as unable to find a comfortable position, constantly moving and shifting as if trying to escape internal agony, which is typical of pancreatitis sufferers. But perhaps the most intriguing medical theory is that Alexander died of West Nile virus, a mosquito-borne disease that can cause high fever, paralysis, and death. This theory was first proposed by Dr. John Marr, an epidemiologist who specializes in historical disease outbreaks. West Nile virus would have been endemic in the marshy regions around Babylon, where Alexander was staying at the time of his illness. The disease is transmitted by mosquitoes that breed in standing water, and the complex irrigation system around Babylon would have provided ideal breeding grounds for these insects. The symptoms of West Nile virus match the historical descriptions remarkably well. The disease typically begins with high fever, headache, and muscle weakness. In severe cases, it can progress to encephalitis, inflammation of the brain that causes paralysis while leaving cognitive function intact. This would explain why Alexander remained mentally alert even as his body became increasingly unresponsive. Dr. Marr points out that West Nile virus can also cause the kind of prolonged illness described in historical accounts. Unlike many other diseases, West Nile can linger for weeks or even months, with symptoms that come and go in waves. This would explain both the 11-day duration of Alexander's illness and the periods of apparent improvement that gave his supporters false hope. The West Nile theory is particularly compelling because it would explain why Alexander's physicians were completely baffled by his illness. Ancient medicine had no understanding of mosquito-borne diseases, and the symptoms of West Nile virus would have seemed completely mysterious to physicians trained in Greek medical theory. Moreover, the disease would have been virtually impossible to prevent with ancient medical knowledge, even if Alexander's doctors had suspected that mosquitoes were involved. They wouldn't have understood the mechanism of transmission or known how to protect their patient from further infection. Another exotic medical theory suggests that Alexander died of anthrax poisoning. Anthrax is a bacterial infection that can be contracted by handling infected animal products, and it can cause symptoms similar to those described in Alexander's final illness. This theory is based on the fact that Alexander was known to handle various animal products during religious ceremonies and military rituals. Ancient rulers often participated in animal sacrifices, touching and handling carcasses that might have been infected with anthrax bacteria. Anthrax poisoning can cause high fever, severe abdominal pain, and respiratory distress, all of which match historical descriptions of Alexander's symptoms. The disease can also cause a distinctive type of skin lesion, though ancient sources don't clearly describe any skin problems in Alexander's final illness. But the anthrax theory faces significant problems. The disease typically kills quickly, not over the course of 11 days. Moreover, anthrax infections usually leave distinctive physical signs that would have been noticed by ancient physicians, even with their limited understanding of bacterial diseases. Yet another medical theory proposes that Alexander died of malaria, one of the most common causes of death in the ancient world. Malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes and would have been endemic in the marshy regions around Babylon. The disease causes high fever, severe chills, and weakness, all of which are mentioned in historical accounts of Alexander's illness. Malaria can also cause cerebral complications in severe cases, leading to confusion, paralysis, and death. Dr. Robert Sattlers, a specialist in ancient diseases, has argued that malaria is the most likely explanation for Alexander's death. He points out that the disease was extremely common in the ancient world, and that Alexander's symptoms are consistent with a severe malarial infection complicated by other factors. The malaria theory is supported by the fact that Alexander had been campaigning in tropical regions for years, where he would have been repeatedly exposed to the disease. While he might have developed some immunity through previous infections, the stress of ruling an empire and planning new conquests could have weakened his resistance to the parasite. But like all the medical theories, malaria doesn't explain every aspect of Alexander's death. The 11-day duration seems unusually long for a malarial crisis, and the specific pattern of symptoms doesn't perfectly match what modern physicians would expect from the disease. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing medical theory of all, that Alexander died of multiple organ failure brought on by chronic poisoning, not from a single dose of poison administered at the drinking party, but from years of gradual exposure to toxic substances. This theory suggests that Alexander's death wasn't the result of a specific assassination attempt, but rather the cumulative effect of living in an environment saturated with toxic materials. Ancient civilizations used lead extensively in everything from makeup to cooking utensils, and chronic lead poisoning can cause symptoms similar to those described in Alexander's final illness. Lead poisoning causes abdominal pain, weakness, and neurological problems, all of which match historical descriptions of Alexander's symptoms. Chronic exposure to lead can also cause kidney damage and other organ problems that might not be immediately obvious but could eventually prove fatal. Alexander would have been exposed to lead through multiple sources throughout his life. Ancient wine was often stored in lead-lined containers and sometimes sweetened with lead-based compounds. Cosmetics and medicines contained lead-based ingredients. Even the water supply in many ancient cities was contaminated with lead from pipes and storage vessels. Moreover, Alexander's lifestyle would have increased his exposure to toxic substances. His heavy drinking would have meant consuming large quantities of lead-contaminated wine. His use of various medicines and cosmetics would have exposed him to additional toxic substances. His residence in different cities throughout his empire would have exposed him to various environmental toxins. Dr. Pat Wheatley, an Australian historian, has argued that chronic lead poisoning could explain many aspects of Alexander's behavior in his final years, including his increasing paranoia, his violent mood swings, and his poor judgment. Lead poisoning affects the brain and can cause personality changes that match Alexander's documented behavioral deterioration. The chronic poisoning theory is particularly unsettling because it suggests that Alexander's death wasn't the result of any deliberate action by his enemies, but rather an inevitable consequence of living in an age before environmental health awareness. He would have been slowly killing himself through normal daily activities, consuming toxins that his doctors not only couldn't detect, but actually prescribed as medicines. But perhaps the most plausible medical explanation for Alexander's death is the simplest one, that he died of a combination of factors that were so common in the ancient world that they barely merit historical attention. Consider the circumstances. Alexander was in Babylon, a city with questionable sanitation and a hot, humid climate that was ideal for breeding disease. He was physically and mentally exhausted from years of constant warfare. He had a compromised immune system from multiple previous illnesses and injuries. He was drinking heavily and eating irregularly. He was under enormous stress from the political pressures of ruling a vast empire. In such circumstances, any number of common infections could have killed him. A simple case of food poisoning, combined with dehydration and exhaustion, might have been enough to push his weakened system over the edge. A minor respiratory infection that his compromised immune system couldn't fight off could have developed into something fatal. The exotic symptoms described in historical accounts might have been exaggerated, misunderstood, or invented entirely by ancient writers who had their own agendas. The paralysis might have been simple weakness, magnified by dramatic interpretation. The preservation of his body might have been wishful thinking or deliberate misrepresentation by those who wanted to promote the idea that Alexander was divine. Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy, a military historian who has written extensively about Alexander, argues that the king's death was probably mundane and medically unremarkable. He points out that sudden death from infection was extremely common in the ancient world, particularly among people who had been weakened by years of physical stress and exposure to unsanitary conditions. From this perspective, Alexander's death was neither mysterious nor dramatic. It was the ordinary result of living in an age before antibiotics, modern medicine, and basic understanding of hygiene. He died the way most people died in the ancient world, young, suddenly, and from causes that would be easily treatable today. But this explanation, while medically sound, doesn't satisfy our desire for mystery and drama. We want Alexander's death to be worthy of his life, to be as extraordinary as his conquests. The idea that the man who conquered the known world could be killed by something as mundane as food poisoning or a common infection seems almost insulting to his memory. And that's probably why the mystery of Alexander's death has persisted for over 2,000 years. It's not that the evidence is particularly ambiguous, it's that we don't want to accept the most likely explanation. We want there to be poison, or curses, or rare diseases, or some combination of exotic factors that would make Alexander's death as remarkable as his life. The truth is probably much simpler and much sadder. Alexander the Great died because he was mortal, and mortality in the ancient world was a much more fragile thing than it is today. His body, pushed beyond all reasonable limits by years of warfare, stress, and poor health choices, finally gave out. The mystery isn't how he died. The mystery is how he managed to survive as long as he did. But let's not let medical realism completely spoil the fun. There are still aspects of Alexander's death that remain genuinely mysterious. Details that don't fit neatly into any explanation, medical or otherwise. There's the matter of timing. Alexander fell ill just as he was planning his most ambitious campaign yet, the conquest of Arabia. This would have been a massive undertaking, requiring months of preparation and the mobilization of enormous resources. If someone wanted to stop Alexander, this would have been the perfect moment to strike. The Arabian campaign wasn't just another conquest in Alexander's long list of military adventures. It represented something fundamentally different, an attempt to extend his empire beyond the limits of the known world. Previous campaigns had been about conquering existing civilizations and incorporating them into his empire. Arabia was largely unexplored territory, a venture into the unknown that would have tested even Alexander's legendary military skills. The scale of preparation required for such a campaign was staggering. Alexander had been assembling ships from across his empire, planning to field the largest naval force in ancient history. He'd been recruiting soldiers from every corner of his domain, promising them wealth and glory in exchange for following him into the desert. The logistical challenges alone would have dwarfed anything he'd attempted before. But the Arabian campaign also represented something more troubling, evidence that Alexander couldn't stop conquering. He'd already achieved more than any military commander in history, ruling an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. A rational ruler might have focused on consolidating these gains, building institutions, and preparing for succession. Instead, Alexander was planning even more aggressive expansion. After Arabia, he talked about conquering the mysterious lands of North Africa, perhaps sailing round the continent to attack Carthage from an unexpected direction. He spoke of expeditions to the far north, to the legendary Hyperboreans, who lived beyond the world's edge. He seemed driven by an obsession that bordered on mental illness. If Alexander's advisors wanted to stop this madness, his illness and death would have been remarkably convenient. A dead Alexander couldn't launch impossible campaigns that would drain the empire's resources and potentially destroy everything he'd built. From this perspective, the timing of his death seems almost too perfect to be coincidental. There's also the question of the conspiracy of silence that surrounded Alexander's death. Many of the people who were closest to Alexander in his final days later became the rulers of the various kingdoms that emerged from the breakup of his empire. These men, the so-called Diadochi or successors, had every reason to suppress any evidence of foul play, whether they were involved in it or not. The successors' behavior after Alexander's death is suggestive. Instead of conducting a thorough investigation into their king's mysterious illness, they immediately began fighting each other for control of his empire. Within months of Alexander's death, his generals were at war with each other, carving up his territories and establishing their own kingdoms. This haste seems suspicious. If Alexander had died of natural causes, you might expect his closest associates to spend some time mourning, to conduct proper funeral rites, and to make careful plans for succession. Instead, they acted like men who'd been waiting for Alexander to die, who had already made their plans and were eager to implement them. Ptolemy immediately seized control of Egypt and began establishing his own dynasty. Seleucus took control of Babylon and the eastern provinces. Antigonus claimed authority over much of Asia Minor. These weren't the actions of men who were shocked and unprepared for their king's death. They were the actions of men who'd been planning for this moment. If Alexander had been murdered, revealing this fact would have raised uncomfortable questions about the successors' own legitimacy as rulers. If they'd known about the conspiracy and done nothing to prevent it, they would have been complicit in their king's death. If they'd been involved in the conspiracy themselves, they would have been guilty of regicide, one of the most serious crimes imaginable in the ancient world. On the other hand, if Alexander had died of natural causes but had been planning to replace his current administrators with other officials, the successors had reasons to let people believe he might have been murdered. Suspicions of foul play would deflect attention from their own ambitious grabs for power and help legitimize their claims to rule. The result was a historical record that is remarkably vague about the specific details of Alexander's final days. We know he was ill, we know he died, but the exact sequence of events, the specific symptoms, and the reactions of those around him are all somewhat unclear. This ambiguity might not be accidental. Consider what we don't know about Alexander's death. We don't know exactly what he ate or drank in his final days. Other than the wine at Medius's party, we don't know which doctors treated him or what treatments they attempted. We don't know who was present during his final moments or what his last words actually were. We don't know how his body was prepared for burial or who made those decisions. These aren't trivial details. They're exactly the kind of information that would be preserved if people wanted the truth to be known. The fact that such crucial information is missing from the historical record suggests that someone, at some point, decided that certain details were better left unrecorded. This conspiracy of silence extended beyond the immediate aftermath of Alexander's death. Even decades later, when various historians began writing accounts of Alexander's life and death, they seemed reluctant to investigate the circumstances too closely. The historians who had the best access to eyewitness testimony were often patronized by the successors, who wouldn't have appreciated inconvenient questions about how Alexander really died. The result is that our best sources for Alexander's death are either too vague to be useful, or they were written by people who had strong political reasons to avoid certain interpretations of events. We're left trying to solve a murder mystery where the crime scene has been cleaned, the witnesses have been intimidated, and the investigators had conflicts of interest. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Alexander mystery isn't the possibility that he was murdered. It's the possibility that his death was entirely preventable, and that he killed himself through sheer stupidity and arrogance. By the time of his death, Alexander had been campaigning continuously for over a decade. He had pushed his body to its absolute limits, marching thousands of miles across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. He had survived multiple battle wounds, including a near-fatal arrow wound to the chest in India that punctured his lung and left him coughing up blood for weeks. He had contracted and recovered from various tropical diseases during his campaigns in India and Central Asia. He had survived extremes of climate, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of India. He had endured physical hardships that would have killed most men long before they reached his age. But Alexander wasn't content to be merely human. He was driven by an obsession with achievement that made him ignore the warning signs that his body was failing. He refused to acknowledge that he had physical limitations, that he needed rest, that he couldn't continue pushing himself indefinitely. In his final years, Alexander's behavior became increasingly erratic and self-destructive. He drank heavily, not just at parties, but as a regular part of his routine. Ancient sources describe him as consuming quantities of wine that would have put modern alcoholics in the hospital, often drinking continuously for days during religious festivals and victory celebrations. He made increasingly risky military decisions, putting himself in unnecessary danger during battles where his presence on the front lines served no strategic purpose. During the siege of the Malian city in India, Alexander personally led an assault on the walls, jumping down into the enemy city with only 2 companions for support. He was seriously wounded in the fighting and nearly died from his injuries. He alienated his closest advisors and friends, executing or exiling anyone who questioned his judgment or tried to moderate his behavior. The men who'd followed him from Macedonia to India, who'd shared the hardships of his campaigns and celebrated his victories, found themselves walking on eggshells around a king who seemed increasingly unstable. Perhaps most tellingly, Alexander refused to name a successor or make any serious preparations for what would happen to his empire after his death. When asked on his deathbed who should inherit his territories, he allegedly replied, "The strongest." This wasn't wisdom, It was the response of a man who was so obsessed with his own legend that he couldn't bear the thought of anyone else wielding his power. The result was predictable and catastrophic. Within years of Alexander's death, his empire collapsed into civil war as his generals fought each other for control. The unity he had imposed through conquest dissolved into chaos, and millions died in the wars that followed. Cities were destroyed, populations were slaughtered, and the cultural achievements of his reign were lost in decades of warfare. From this perspective, Alexander's death wasn't mysterious at all. It was the inevitable result of a lifestyle that was unsustainable, a level of physical and mental stress that no human body could endure indefinitely, and a personality that was fundamentally incapable of recognizing its own limitations. The mystery of Alexander's death has also had a profound impact on how we understand the relationship between individual achievement and historical change. Alexander's death marked the end of what historians call the great man theory of history, the idea that individual leaders can single-handedly shape the course of world events. Alexander's empire didn't survive his death because it was entirely dependent on his personal charisma and leadership. Without him, it immediately fragmented into competing kingdoms that spent decades fighting each other. This suggests that even the most impressive individual achievements are ultimately dependent on broader social, economic, and political forces. The mystery of how Alexander died has overshadowed the more important question of why his empire collapsed so quickly after his death. But the second question might be more historically significant than the first. Alexander's failure to create lasting institutions, his inability to prepare for succession, and his empire's immediate collapse after his death all point to fundamental limitations in his approach to conquest and governance. Alexander was a military genius, but he was a terrible administrator. He conquered territories faster than he could effectively govern them, creating an empire that was held together by force and personal loyalty, rather than by institutions and laws. When he died, there was no governmental structure capable of maintaining unity, no legal system that could resolve disputes peacefully, and no succession plan that could prevent civil war. From this perspective, the mystery of Alexander's death is a distraction from more important historical questions about the nature of political power, the relationship between conquest and governance, and the factors that determine whether political achievements will endure. But perhaps we're overthinking this. Perhaps the mystery of Alexander's death persists simply because it's a good story, and good stories have a way of surviving long after the facts that inspired them have been forgotten or distorted. Alexander's death has all the elements of a classic mystery: a powerful victim, a cast of suspects with clear motives, ambiguous evidence, and no clear resolution. It's the kind of story that invites speculation and debate, that allows each generation to impose its own interpretation on the available evidence. The mystery has become a kind of historical Rorschach test, where each era sees in Alexander's death a reflection of its own fears and anxieties. Medieval writers saw divine punishment for pride. Renaissance scholars viewed it as classical tragedy. Enlightenment historians looked for rational, natural explanations. Modern investigators have used it as a case study in everything from tropical medicine to political assassination. In the end, the mystery of Alexander's death might be less about Alexander himself than about our own relationship with mystery and uncertainty. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, where most questions can be answered with a quick internet search. The idea that a major historical event could remain genuinely mysterious, that there could be important questions without clear answers, is both frustrating and oddly comforting. The mystery reminds us that history is not a collection of established facts, but an ongoing process of interpretation and reinterpretation. Each generation brings its own perspectives, technologies, and concerns to historical questions, and each generation discovers new aspects of old mysteries. Perhaps that's why the mystery of Alexander's death continues to fascinate us. not because we expect to solve it, but because the process of trying to solve it tells us something important about ourselves and our relationship with the past. Alexander the Great died over 2,000 years ago, but the mystery of his death continues to live. It lives in the work of historians who continue to analyze the available evidence, in the imagination of writers who use his story as inspiration for fiction, and in the curiosity of ordinary people who wonder what really happened to the man who conquered the world. The mystery has become, in its own way, more enduring than Alexander's empire. His political achievements lasted barely a generation, but the questions surrounding his death have persisted for over 2 millennia. In a strange way, the mystery of how Alexander died has made him more immortal than all his conquests combined, and maybe that's fitting. Alexander spent his entire adult life trying to achieve immortality through conquest and glory. He wanted to be remembered as a god, as a figure whose achievements would echo through history forever. Instead, he's remembered primarily as a mystery, as a question without a clear answer. There's something poetic about that, something that would probably have frustrated Alexander himself. The man who conquered the known world, who never lost a battle, who inspired generations of would-be conquerors, is ultimately remembered not for what he achieved, but for how he died. But perhaps that's appropriate for someone whose life was as extraordinary as Alexander's. Ordinary deaths are for ordinary people. Alexander the Great deserved a mysterious death, a death that would puzzle historians and inspire storytellers for centuries to come. In the end, maybe the mystery of Alexander's death is the perfect ending to his story. He lived an impossible life, achieved impossible things, and died an impossible death. The mystery is the final conquest, the last territory that Alexander claimed for himself, our imagination. So what killed Alexander the Great? Was it poison slipped into his wine by a jealous rival? Was it a curse from the gods, angry at his hubris? Was it a rare tropical disease that baffled ancient physicians? Was it simple exhaustion and illness, dramatized by writers who needed a story worthy of their subject? The truth is, we'll probably never know for certain, and maybe that's exactly as it should be. Some mysteries are worth preserving, some questions are more valuable than their answers, and some stories are too good to spoil with facts. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, but he couldn't conquer death. Death conquered him instead, and in doing so, created a mystery that has proven more enduring than any empire. Tonight, as you go to sleep, remember that somewhere in the ancient world, a 32-year-old king took his last breath, and the mystery of how and why has been keeping people awake ever since. Alexander may have failed to achieve true immortality, but his death, at least, has proven to be eternal. And if that's not the kind of twisted, poetic justice that would make the ancient gods smile, then nothing is. Good night, and sweet dreams. Try not to think too hard about mysterious deaths and ancient conspiracies. After all, you wouldn't want to end up like Alexander, remembered more for how you died than for how you lived. Though, to be fair, being remembered for over 2,000 years isn't the worst fate in the world, even if it comes with a side of eternal mystery and scholarly debate. Alexander the Great, he came, he saw, he conquered, and he died in a way that continues to baffle people more than 20 centuries later. If that's not a legacy worth having, then what is? The man who never lost a battle ultimately lost the greatest battle of all, the battle against time, mortality, and the simple fact that even the greatest among us are still, in the end, only human. But then again, maybe that's the most human thing about Alexander, not his conquests, not his achievements, but the fact that he died, mysteriously and suddenly, leaving behind more questions than answers, just like the rest of us will, someday. But wait, there's more to this story than even the most elaborate conspiracy theories can explain. Because the real mystery of Alexander's death isn't just about how he died, it's about what his death revealed about the nature of power, ambition, and the human condition itself. You see, Alexander's death didn't just end a life, It ended an entire worldview. For over a decade, Alexander had been more than just a king or a conqueror. He had been a force of nature, a living embodiment of human potential unleashed. His existence had proven that the impossible was merely difficult, that the boundaries of human achievement were far more elastic than anyone had previously imagined. When Alexander died, the world didn't just lose a ruler. It lost the belief that one man could reshape reality through sheer force of will. The age of heroes, which had begun with the semi-mythical figures of Homer's epics, came to an end in a sick room in Babylon. After Alexander, no one would ever again believe that a single individual could conquer the world and bend history to their personal vision. This psychological shift was perhaps more significant than the political chaos that followed Alexander's death. The Hellenistic world that emerged from the wreckage of his empire was fundamentally different from the one that had produced him. It was more cynical, more realistic, more aware of human limitations. The kings who ruled the successor kingdoms were competent administrators and capable generals, but none of them had Alexander's megalomaniacal belief in their own unlimited potential. The mystery of Alexander's death became a kind of cultural trauma, a wound in the collective psyche of the ancient world that never quite healed. How do you explain the sudden end of someone who had seemed to transcend ordinary human limitations? How do you make sense of mortality striking down someone who had achieved the impossible? The various theories about Alexander's death, poison, curse, disease, can all be understood as attempts to rationalize the irrational, to explain the inexplicable. Each theory offers a different way of understanding how the superhuman can suddenly become all too human. The poison theory suggests that even the greatest men are vulnerable to the malice of lesser beings. Alexander might have been untouchable on the battlefield, but he was still mortal enough to be killed by a few drops of the right substance in his wine. There's a democratic element to this interpretation. It suggests that even the most powerful person is still subject to the schemes of ordinary mortals. The curse theory implies that there are cosmic forces more powerful than human will, that the universe itself has limits on how much one person can achieve before divine intervention stops them. This interpretation preserves Alexander's specialness while explaining his death as the inevitable result of exceeding divinely ordained boundaries. The medical theories are perhaps the most unsettling of all, because they suggest that Alexander's death was entirely mundane. He didn't die because he was special, but because he was ordinary. His body failed the way all human bodies eventually fail, regardless of their owner's achievements or ambitions. But there's another possibility that historians have largely overlooked, that Alexander's death was neither mysterious nor accidental, but was actually the logical culmination of everything he had become. Consider Alexander's psychology in his final years. This was a man who had achieved literally everything he had ever dreamed of achieving, and more. He had surpassed his hero Achilles, exceeded his father Philip's achievements, and conquered territories that existed only in legend when he began his campaigns. He had gone further than Heracles, seen more than Odysseus, and conquered more than any mortal in history. And yet, he was miserable. Ancient sources describe Alexander in his final months as increasingly restless, paranoid, and dissatisfied. He had everything, but nothing was enough. Every conquest only revealed new territories to conquer. Every achievement only highlighted new goals to pursue. He was like a man addicted to success, always needing the next fix, the next impossible challenge to overcome. Psychologists today would recognize this pattern. Alexander displayed many of the characteristics of what we now call success syndrome or achievement addiction. He had tied his entire sense of self-worth to his ability to conquer and achieve, and when there were no more meaningful conquests left, he began to lose his sense of purpose and identity. The Arabian campaign that Alexander was planning at the time of his death wasn't just another military expedition. It was a desperate attempt to recapture the sense of purpose and excitement that had driven him for so long. But Arabia was largely desert, populated by nomadic tribes that had little worth conquering. The campaign would have been enormously expensive, logistically nightmarish, and ultimately pointless from any rational perspective. Alexander was planning it anyway, because he literally didn't know how to do anything else. Conquest had become his entire identity, and without it, he was nothing. He couldn't stop, because stopping meant confronting the emptiness that lay beneath all his achievements. This psychological state might have made Alexander particularly vulnerable to illness, stress, and the various other factors that ultimately killed him. Modern medicine recognizes the connection between mental state and physical health, and Alexander's psychological crisis in his final months would have compromised his immune system and made him more susceptible to disease. From this perspective, Alexander's death becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of tying one's entire identity to external achievements. He conquered the world, but he never conquered himself. He understood how to lead armies, but he never learned how to find meaning in life beyond constant striving for more. The mystery of Alexander's death, then, might be less about the specific cause of his physical demise and more about the spiritual and psychological death that had already occurred. Alexander the person might have died long before Alexander the body gave out in Babylon. This interpretation helps explain some of the more bizarre aspects of Alexander's final years, including his demand that his subjects worship him as a god. This wasn't just political theater or megalomania. It was the desperate attempt of a man who had lost his sense of human identity to find meaning in divinity. If Alexander was divine, then his achievements made sense. Gods were supposed to perform impossible feats and transcend human limitations. But if he was merely human, then his conquests were ultimately meaningless, temporary achievements that would fade with time like everything else in the mortal world. The tragedy of Alexander's death is that he achieved immortality in exactly the wrong way. He wanted to be remembered as a god, but instead he's remembered as a mystery. He wanted his achievements to be eternal, but instead his death has proven more enduring than any of his conquests. But perhaps there's a deeper lesson in the mystery of Alexander's death, one that goes beyond ancient history and speaks to something universal about human nature and the pursuit of greatness. Alexander's story is, in many ways, the story of human ambition taken to its logical extreme. He represents what happens when someone refuses to accept any limitations on their desires, when they commit themselves totally to the pursuit of power and achievement without regard for the costs. His death reminds us that there are limits, both physical and spiritual, to what any individual can achieve. No matter how great our accomplishments, no matter how far we push the boundaries of human potential, we are still mortal beings subject to the same fundamental vulnerabilities that affect everyone else. The mystery of how Alexander died is less important than the certainty that he did die. His death is proof that even the most extraordinary lives are still, ultimately, just lives. They have beginnings, middles, and ends, just like everyone else's. This might seem like a depressing conclusion, but it's actually liberating. If even Alexander the Great was subject to mortality, then the rest of us can stop trying to achieve impossible perfection and focus instead on living meaningful, fulfilling lives within our human limitations. The ancient Greeks had a concept called sophrosyn, which roughly translates as wisdom, moderation, or self-knowledge. It was the idea that the highest form of wisdom was understanding your own limitations and living within them. Alexander possessed every virtue except this one, and its absence ultimately destroyed him. Modern readers might find this ancient wisdom particularly relevant in our current age of social media, where everyone is constantly comparing their achievements to others, where success is measured by external metrics, and where the pressure to constantly achieve and improve can become overwhelming. Alexander's story reminds us that external achievements, no matter how impressive, cannot provide lasting satisfaction or meaning. True contentment comes from within, from accepting ourselves as we are rather than constantly striving to become something more. The mystery of Alexander's death has persisted for over 2 millennia, not because it's historically significant, but because it represents something timeless about the human condition. It's the story of someone who achieved everything they thought they wanted, only to discover that it wasn't enough. It's the story of someone who conquered the world, but couldn't conquer their own inner demons. In that sense, Alexander's death isn't mysterious at all. It's inevitable. It's what happens when human ambition exceeds human wisdom, when the desire for more becomes more important than the appreciation of what we already have. The real mystery isn't how Alexander died, but how he lived for as long as he did with such an unsustainable approach to life. The fact that he managed to achieve as much as he did while carrying such enormous psychological burdens is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his entire story. But let's return to the more immediate mystery for a moment, because there are still some genuinely puzzling aspects of Alexander's death that deserve consideration. One of the most intriguing details is the behavior of Alexander's horse, Bucephalus. In the weeks leading up to his master's death, Bucephalus had been Alexander's companion for over 2 decades, carrying him across 3 continents and through dozens of battles. Ancient sources describe the horse as almost supernaturally intelligent, capable of understanding Alexander's commands and intentions in ways that seemed to transcend normal animal behavior. In the weeks before Alexander fell ill, several witnesses reported that Bucephalus began acting strangely. The horse, normally calm and obedient, became skittish and nervous around his master. He would shy away from Alexander's touch, refuse to eat treats from his hand, and generally behave as if he sensed some kind of danger. Ancient peoples, who believed that animals were more sensitive to supernatural influences than humans, interpreted this behavior as a sign that Bucephalus could sense the approaching doom that awaited his master. Modern animal behaviorists might suggest that the horse was responding to subtle changes in Alexander's scent or behavior that indicated illness or stress. But Bucephalus's behavior becomes even more interesting when we consider that the horse died just a few weeks before Alexander himself fell ill. Ancient sources describe the horse as dying suddenly and mysteriously, without any obvious cause. Some accounts suggest that Bucephalus simply lay down one day and refused to get up, as if he had decided that his life's work was complete. The timing is certainly suspicious. If Alexander was being slowly poisoned over time, it's possible that Bucephalus was also being affected by the same substances. Horses are actually more sensitive to many toxins than humans, so the animal might have succumbed to poisoning before his master showed obvious symptoms. Alternatively, if Alexander's death was the result of some kind of curse or supernatural intervention, then Bucephalus's death might have been a warning sign that Alexander was too arrogant or too distracted to heed. Or, most prosaically, both Alexander and his horse might have been affected by the same environmental factors, disease, contaminated water, or other mundane causes that were common in the ancient world. But there's something poetic about the idea that Alexander's faithful companion preceded him in death, as if clearing the way for his master's journey to whatever realm awaits the spirits of great conquerors and their horses. Another puzzling aspect of Alexander's death is the reaction of his army when they learned of his illness. These were men who had followed Alexander across the known world, who had trusted him with their lives in countless battles, who had shared in his victories and his hardships. You might expect them to be devastated by the news that their beloved leader was dying. Instead, many of his soldiers seemed almost relieved. Ancient sources describe a complex mixture of emotions in Alexander's army when word spread that he was seriously ill. There was certainly grief and concern, but there was also something else, a sense that perhaps their long ordeal was finally coming to an end. By 323 BCE, Alexander's army had been campaigning continuously for over a decade. They had marched thousands of miles, fought dozens of battles, and endured hardships that would have broken lesser men. They were tired, homesick, and increasingly resentful of Alexander's seemingly endless appetite for conquest. The mutiny in India, when Alexander's troops had refused to march further east, had been a warning sign that even the most loyal soldiers had limits to their endurance. Alexander had managed to convince them to turn back, but the incident had revealed deep fractures in the relationship between the king and his army. Many of Alexander's soldiers had families back in Macedonia that they hadn't seen in years. They had accumulated wealth from their conquests, but they couldn't enjoy it while constantly on campaign. They had achieved glory beyond their wildest dreams, but they were beginning to wonder if the cost was worth it. When Alexander announced his plans for the Arabian campaign, the reaction among his troops was reportedly lukewarm at best. They had followed him to India and back, but the idea of marching into another unknown desert held little appeal for men who just wanted to go home. Alexander's illness, from this perspective, might have seemed like divine intervention on behalf of exhausted soldiers who didn't dare rebel against their king but desperately wanted the campaigning to stop. A sick Alexander couldn't launch new conquests, couldn't drag them into another impossible military adventure, couldn't continue pushing them beyond their limits. This doesn't mean that Alexander's soldiers conspired to kill him, but it does suggest that his death might not have been as unwelcome as you might expect. The army's relatively calm acceptance of Alexander's illness and death, compared to their violent reactions to previous crises, suggests that many soldiers saw his demise as a natural end to an unnatural situation. The question of Alexander's sexuality has also been raised in connection with his death, though this is one of the more speculative areas of historical investigation. Alexander's personal relationships were complex and have been the subject of considerable debate among historians. He was married to Roxana, a Bactrian princess, and had at least one child with her, but he also had extremely close relationships with male friends and companions, particularly Hephaestion, who was described by ancient sources as Alexander's lover and closest confidant. Hephaestion had died a few months before Alexander, and the king's grief was reportedly so intense that it bordered on madness. Alexander declared that Hephaestion should be worshipped as a hero, ordered elaborate funeral preparations that cost enormous sums, and fell into a depression that affected his ability to function as a ruler. Some historians have suggested that Alexander's death might have been related to his grief over Hephaestion's loss. Severe depression can compromise the immune system and make individuals more susceptible to illness. Alexander's psychological state after Hephaestion's death might have left him vulnerable to whatever ultimately killed him. There's also the possibility that Alexander's death was connected to sexually transmitted diseases, though this is highly speculative given the limited medical knowledge of the ancient world. Ancient physicians wouldn't have understood the connection between sexual activity and certain types of illness, so such conditions might not have been properly documented in historical accounts. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the sexuality question is what it reveals about Alexander's isolation in his final years. Whether his relationships were primarily heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual, the evidence suggests that he was increasingly alone as his reign progressed. His marriage to Roxana was primarily political, designed to solidify his control over Bactria rather than based on personal affection. His relationships with his generals and companions became increasingly strained as his paranoia and megalomania grew. Even his closest friends found themselves walking on eggshells around a king who seemed capable of turning violent at any perceived slight. The death of Hephaestion, whether he was a lover, a friend, or both, deprived Alexander of perhaps the last person who could speak honestly to him without fear of retribution. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander was truly alone, surrounded by courtiers and subordinates, but lacking anyone who genuinely cared about his well-being rather than his power. This isolation might have been a contributing factor to Alexander's death, not because loneliness is directly fatal, but because it left him without the kind of emotional support that might have helped him make better decisions about his health and lifestyle. A truly close friend might have insisted that Alexander moderates his drinking, rest more, or seek medical attention earlier when he began showing signs of illness. Instead, Alexander was surrounded by people who told him what they thought he wanted to hear, who encouraged his grandiose plans and fed his ego, who were more concerned with maintaining their positions than with their king's actual well-being. The mystery of Alexander's death is also complicated by the ancient world's different understanding of medical causation. Modern medicine recognizes complex interactions between psychological, social, and biological factors in disease and death. Ancient physicians, working with much more limited knowledge, tended to look for single, simple causes. This means that even the most detailed ancient accounts of Alexander's illness might be missing crucial information about contributing factors that wouldn't have seemed medically relevant to ancient observers. Stress, diet, sleep patterns, environmental toxins, and other variables that modern medicine considers important might not have been documented by ancient physicians who were focused on more obvious symptoms. For example, Alexander's heavy drinking in his final months might not have been seen by ancient doctors as medically significant, since alcohol consumption was normal and expected in Macedonian culture. They might not have connected his drinking to his physical symptoms, even though modern medicine would recognize alcohol abuse as a major risk factor for various serious health problems. Similarly, Alexander's obvious psychological distress after Hephaestion's death might not have been considered medically relevant by ancient physicians who didn't understand the connection between mental and physical health. They might have treated his physical symptoms without addressing the underlying emotional and psychological factors that were contributing to his illness. This gap between ancient and modern medical understanding means that solving the mystery of Alexander's death requires not just analyzing the available historical evidence, but also reading between the lines to identify factors that ancient sources might have overlooked or underemphasized. It's worth considering, too, that the mystery of Alexander's death might be insoluble, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the question itself is based on false assumptions. We assume that Alexander's death must have had a single, identifiable cause that can be determined through historical investigation, but real life is often more complex than that. Alexander's death might have resulted from a combination of factors that were so interrelated and mutually reinforcing that isolating any single cause is impossible. His physical exhaustion, his psychological stress, his heavy drinking, his exposure to various diseases during his campaigns, his genetic predisposition to certain health problems, and the specific environmental conditions in Babylon might have combined in ways that made his death inevitable regardless of any single triggering event. From this perspective, asking what killed Alexander might be like asking what caused World War I. The answer is so complex and involves so many interconnected factors that any simple explanation is bound to be inadequate. This doesn't mean that investigating Alexander's death is pointless, but it does suggest that we might need to accept a certain amount of ambiguity in our conclusions. The mystery might be part of the reality, not just a result of inadequate historical sources. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to Alexander's memory is that his death remains as extraordinary and puzzling as his life. A man who defied conventional wisdom and achieved the impossible deserves a death that continues to baffle conventional investigation. In the end, the mystery of Alexander's death serves as a reminder that even the most thoroughly documented historical events contain elements that remain beyond our understanding. History is not a collection of solved puzzles, but an ongoing conversation between past and present, where new questions emerge as quickly as old ones are answered. Alexander the Great died over 2,000 years ago, but he continues to live in our imagination, in our debates, and in our endless fascination with the limits of human achievement. His death, mysterious as it remains, is perhaps the most human thing about him. It reminds us that even the greatest among us are still, ultimately, mortal, and maybe that's enough. Maybe the mystery doesn't need to be solved. Maybe some questions are more valuable than their answers, some stories more important than their explanations. Alexander conquered the world, but the world conquered him back. In the end, that might be the only answer we need.